Hello, this is Michael Dowd, and this is part 2 of a 5-part video discussion course called God in Big History. And this is the beta version, so this is unedited. You may hear me stumble on my words. I invite feedback during July and August of 2014, and I'll be incorporating that feedback and any suggestions for improvement and uploading to YouTube a free version that is fully edited, professionally edited for religious and secular study groups in early September. So this one is called Sacred Science. In part 1, which was titled The Big Picture, we covered these two questions: what big history is and why it's important, and how a big history view of God and religion differs from other approaches. In this segment, we'll cover what does big history reveal about the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious or inspirational significance of science, and how have our sources of knowledge and wisdom expanded through time. Now again, as I mentioned during the first one, Reality Reconciles Science and Religion is an 18-minute TEDx talk that I delivered in May of 2014 that's sort of an introduction to this series. So if you haven't already seen that, you may want to check that out. Big history transforms our sense of who we are, to whom we're related, and how we can ensure a just, healthy, and sustainably life-giving future. In other words, there are things that we can learn about how complexity has occurred in the past that can give us some guidance for how to move into a sustainably life-giving future. And this notion of big history transforming our sense of who we are and to whom we're related. I covered who we are, that we are the universe becoming conscious of itself, that we are nature uncovering its own nature in part 1. The sense that humans are not separate from the universe, that we are the universe after some 13.82 billion years of unbroken evolution, now becoming conscious of itself. So we literally, a human being looking through a telescope is literally the universe, gawking at itself. I mean, a human being, a biology student looking through a microscope is the planet Earth learning with awareness, with consciousness, how it's functioned unconsciously and instinctually for billions of years. So that sense of transforming who we are, that we're a lot bigger and a lot older than we thought we were. To whom we're related. One of my favorite quotes from Marlon Navinar, he's the pastor of one of the largest, in fact, I think it's the largest Unitarian Universalist church in the world in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He said, we've all heard some fundamentalist-minded person say, "Don't tell me I'm related to monkeys." But now that we understand DNA and have cracked its code, we know that we're not related. We're not just related to monkeys. We're related to zucchini, so let's get over it. So now let's take a look at how big history transforms this. And also, big history also shows how our sources of insight and understanding have expanded through time, and how this broadens and factualizes or realizes what we even consider to be divine revelation. Loyal Rue is one of the world's leading philosophers of religion, and he's written a number of important books. His first one, A Crisis in the Natural History of Western Civilization. In fact, Connie Barlow, my wife, when she read that, she said that she felt that Loyal Rue was the William James of our time. What he means by amythia is that we're living without a unifying myth. We have no personal relationship to reality because we lack a unifying myth. His book, Everybody's Story, Wising Up to the Epic of Evolution, is one of the best little introductions to big history. It's just a gem. Nature is Enough, I think, is his most recent book, Religious Naturalism and the Meaning of Life. And then his book, Religion is Not About God. What he means is that religion is about our relationship to reality, and yes, reality has been personified as the various gods and goddesses. But what religion is about, what it ought to be about, and what it has traditionally been about, is helping us live in right relationship to our inner and outer reality, and our social reality. And I love this quote from his book, Religion is Not About God. He says, "The most profound insight in the history of humanity is that we should seek to live in accord with reality. Indeed, living in harmony with reality may be accepted as a formal definition of wisdom. If we live at odds with reality, foolishly, then we will be doomed. But if we live in proper relationship with reality, wisely, then we will be saved." Now, he goes on to say that every culture throughout all time has had at least a tacit understanding of this fundamental principle. What we're less in agreement about is how we should think about reality and what we should do to put ourselves into harmony or alignment with it. But that, of course, makes total sense when you realize that these two fundamental questions, what's real and what's important, or how things are and which things matter, these questions would have been answered differently at different times in history and at different places around the world. I mean, it's like, the 5 blind men or 5 blind people and the elephant. I mean, if these were 5 blind men or women and experiencing a different aspect of reality, a different aspect of the elephant, if these were 5 different theologians, especially living at different times in human history, you'd have 5 radically different theologies. And believe it or not, religious differences are not a whole lot more complex than that. It's like, reality 100,000 years ago in a family or clan or band in South Africa is very different than what happens is chaos, drought, climate change, bad news keeps catalyzing creative transformation. We see this throughout evolutionary history. I'll say more about that in a future program. But, what happens is a bunch of families and clans, figure out, because they struggle together, that they can survive together better than they can independently, and tribes emerge. This is how tribes emerged some 50, 60,000 years ago. Then you get a bunch of tribes interacting. They face some crisis, some challenge, some chaos, some difficulty. They figure out how to align the self-interest of each tribe with a new level of complexity, and a chiefdom or a kingdom emerges. And each of these reflect collective intelligence at that scale. And then you get a bunch of chieftains and kingdoms interacting. This is how the world has become as complex as it is. And all the world's religious traditions reflect regional collective intelligence, originally, around what's real and what's important, or how things are, and which things matter. But what we now need isn't just tribal collective intelligence. We don't need just regional collective intelligence. Yes, we need those, but that's not enough. We need global collective intelligence. We need our best globally produced answers to what's real and what's important, or how things are and which things matter. And that's what science is. You don't understand science if you think it's just another language game. The postmodernists have it wrong on that. Science reflects humanity's global collective intelligence. You've got atheist scientists, Christian scientists, Buddhist scientists, Hindu scientists, scientists of all religious tradition and no religious tradition that are all contributing to our best collective intelligence about how things are and which things matter. Now, of course, this begs the question, what's religion? Is religion just supernatural otherworldlyism, as some of the new atheists claim? I suggest to you no, that religions are mythic maps. Oh, by the way, this is me at the bottom of Deer Creek Falls. This actually goes up 140 feet. This is in the Grand Canyon. Connie and I, 4 years ago, rafted down the Grand Canyon for a week with the National Center for Science Education, Jeannie Scott, and a whole bunch of science-oriented people and 3 geologists. It was absolutely amazing, one of the highlights of my life. But religions are mythic maps of reality. Specifically, they're mythic maps of what's real and what's important. And what I mean by mythic is that they're relational. They use metaphor. They use specifically personification as a means, as a way, as an unconscious way of being in right relationship to reality, having a healthy relationship with reality. In fact, we don't know of any culture that has existed for any length of time that hasn't had a mythic map of reality. That's one of the challenges that we're dealing with, as Loyal Root talks about in his book, Amythia. But religions also produce personal wholeness and social coherence. There's no religion in the world that doesn't consistently produce personal wholeness and social coherence by providing a mythic map of what's real and what's important. And religions all provide consistent, reliable access to the feeling states that human beings have always needed to thrive, no matter what your religion, philosophy, background, no matter where in the world you lived or how far back, as long as we've had language, symbolic language. We can't thrive as human beings. We don't thrive as human beings if all we can do is look to the future with fear. We can only thrive when we can look to the future with trust, including trusting that we're not going to be here forever, that we're going to die. All religions have different belief systems that get people to trust, including trusting their mortality. Also, we don't thrive as human beings if all we can do is look to the past with resentment or guilt or bitterness. We can only thrive when we can look to the past with gratitude. In fact, that's what therapy is a secular form of helping people come to gratitude, finding something to be grateful for, where before all we had was bitterness or guilt or resentment. And same thing, We can't thrive as human beings. We don't thrive as human beings if we're overwhelmed by the challenges of the day. We can only thrive as human beings, individually and collectively, when we're inspired to be in action, whatever the challenges are. Because as we all know, compost happens. Just life throws us a pile of junk to deal with. So how do we stay inspired to be in action, whatever the challenges may be? Well, all religions get people to trust, gratitude, and inspiration. And there are other feeling states that humans need to thrive too, comfort in times of sorrow and suffering and that sort of thing. But these are core: trust, gratitude, and inspiration. Trust with regards to the future, gratitude with regards to the past, and inspiration in the moment. And there are many different belief systems that get people there. We didn't have knowledge that could get us there until very recently. We now have knowledge that we can all agree upon that can get us to trust, gratitude, and inspiration. But not in a way that disses or puts down religion, but in a way that helps the religious traditions themselves to evolve. I don't know if you've ever seen this image before, but this is taken by the Cassini mission. And this is actually an uncolored, touched-up photo of a picture of a solar eclipse. The sun is directly behind Saturn. In fact, there at about 7 o'clock, at the very bottom left there, you can see just a little piece of the sun. And that little dot right there, I don't know if you can even see it, but that's planet Earth. We're looking through the rings of Saturn and able to see Earth in the distance. Carl Sagan called a different picture, but the same kind of a shot, the pale blue dot, famous presentation that he did. Now, of course, this is our closest significant galaxy. This is Andromeda galaxy. This is 2.5 million light years away. That is, we're seeing this galaxy, not as it is now, but as it was 2.5 million years ago. It's taken light traveling 11 million miles a minute, 2 million years to reach our eyes. And this is our closest neighbor. In fact, it wasn't until Edwin Hubble in the early 1920s that we were able to discern that the entire universe wasn't the Milky Way, that in fact our Milky Way was only one of practically countless other galaxies. Now, this is a famous Hubble image. This is the extreme deep field photo. And other than one or two stars that you can see that are in the Milky Way, every other dot that you can see, large or small, is a galaxy. And some of these are 9 or 10 billion light years away. Two of our dear friends and colleagues in this movement, Joel Primack and Nancy Ellen Abrams, wrote this: "What's possible versus impossible depends entirely on what universe you're living in. Until you understand the universe you're living in, you cannot know what is possible." And I can't recommend their two books too highly. These are fabulous books. The View from the Center of the Universe and The New Universe and the Human Future. In fact, The New Universe and the Human Future is the book that came out of their Terry lectures that they gave at Yale a few years ago. And The View from the Center of the Universe is still one of the top 10 books I've ever read in my life. In fact, on our website, thegreatstory.org, if you put in View from the Center of the Universe quotes or Primack and Abrams quotes, you'll see Connie and I have distilled out and put on a PDF our 50, I think roughly 50 favorite quotes from The View from the Center of the Universe. Joel Primack, by the way, is one of the leading cosmologists in the world. He's the guy that he and his team developed the mathematics for understanding dark matter and dark energy, which is still the prevailing theory of dark matter and dark energy. And Nancy Ellen Abrams, his wife, is a brilliant science writer and popularizer, and just, they're both amazing. So coming back to these questions, what's real and what's important, or how things are, and which things matter? Religion 1.0, where you went to for your understanding of what's real and what's important, was the minds and the hearts of the elders, the authority of elders. Because prior to writing, where was your understanding? There were no encyclopedias, there was no Google, there was no, books. Where you went to for your best understanding of reality, inner and outer reality, and how to live in right relationship to reality, was the authority of elders, what the elders held in their minds and hearts, and what had been embodied in the rituals and rites of passage. Religion 2.0 is the authority of the sacred text, the authority of Scripture. And Religion 3.0 is the authority of evidence, the authority of science. And each of these reflects collective intelligence. The collective intelligence of elders, the collective intelligence of those groups of men in the 3rd and 4th centuries that discerned which books were authoritative. I mean, there were dozens of epistles and letters and gospels, and these men were arguing and debating and which ones were authoritative, which felt authentic, and it was their collective intelligence that we now rely on in terms of our understanding of canon, of sacred scripture. And then, of course, religion 3.0 is the authority of science. And when I use religion, I'm meaning a system of a worldview and set of practices that help us live in right relationship to reality. And the authority of science is collective intelligence. It's global collective intelligence. Thomas Berry, my main mentor, died a few years ago, one of the real granddaddies of the big history movement. He says it's all a question of story. We're in trouble just now because we're in between stories. The old story, the account of how the world came to be and how we fit into it, sustained us for a long time. It shaped our emotional attitudes and provided us with life purpose. It energized action, consecrated suffering, integrated knowledge, and guided education. We awoke in the morning and knew where we were. We could answer the questions of our children. We could identify crime, punish transgressors. Everything was taken care of because the story was there. But today, this traditional narrative is no longer functioning properly, and we have not yet learned the new story. Big history. The International Big History Association is an amazing organization. They've now sponsored 2 international conferences. This one, there was 4 of us, Kathy Russell on the left, John Host, my wife Connie Barlow, and myself. We all have our great story beads, or our Kosmala is the way John Host talks about it. He's a material scientist. He's also, both Kathy and John do these amazing stuff for kids in terms of teaching big history for kids. The Cosmic Rosary, many Catholic nuns have also independently co-created the Cosmic Rosary, or Great Story Beads. In fact, if you put Great Story Beads in Google, you'll get, in fact, any of these terms, you'll get web pages that help you, create these and that sort of thing. Each bead signifies some significant event in the history of everyone and everything. And if you're watching this or listening to this prior to August 6th through 10th of 2014, the International Big History Association is having their 2nd major conference out in San Rafael, California at Dominican University. And so you might want to check that out if you're drawn to big history. Here, John Host is doing a presentation at last year, or 2 years ago, in Grand Rapids, Michigan. There was the first Big History. And you can see down the bottom left, he's getting Walter Alvarez to sign his bead, W.A., for the bead that he uses for the extinction of the dinosaurs, which, of course, Walter Alvarez and his father discovered. And here are pictures we have on the Great Story website of various kids, of Montessori school kids. There's many different ways to do this, but it's really fun and also deeply meaningful for those of us that have created a set of great story beads. I find rather helpful using this cosmic century timeline. Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson in his recent reboot, the redo of Carl Sagan's Cosmos series, which was fabulous. I highly recommend getting the DVDs for that. But I find more helpful than a 1-year time frame the cosmic century, compressing the entire 13.82 billion year history of the universe, 14 billion years rounded off, history of the universe into 100 years. And at that time scale, every decade is 1.4 billion years, every year is 140 million years, every day is 400,000 years, and every minute is 250 years. Obviously, I'm rounding these off. And at that time scale, the first atoms, hydrogen and helium nuclei, formed at day 2 on this time scale. Early galaxies in the first 10 or 15 years, we find these early proto-galaxies and then early galaxies that then over time, over the decades, over the billions of years, swallow up other galaxies. Our solar system formed at 67 on this time scale. At 69, we find the oceans forming very early on. Bacteria, the first most primitive form, but the most important form of life, bacteria and archaea, at 72 2. At 73, we find photosynthesis. Life learns to eat. Bacteria learn to eat the photons of the sun and gain energy from the photons of the sun. Major, major discovery or innovation or emergent complexity. The great pollution crisis of 87. The oxygen pollution crisis, which actually forces a new level of complexity. Eukaryotic cells with a nucleus emerge at that point. Chaos keeps driving complexity and interdependence and cooperation at larger and wider scale. Multicellularity, a new level of complexity, emerges at 91. Sex, sperm and eggs emerge at 92. And first communion, what I humorously call first communion, that is heterotrophy. That is creatures eating other creatures. For the first time, creatures start eating other creatures at 94. Now, let's just take the last 5 years and span that out to a new time scale here. So if we look at the last 5 years, that is the last 700 million years on a 13.8 billion year time scale, the last 5 years on a cosmic century time scale, where each year is roughly 140 million years. At that time scale, we see brains and nervous systems emerge in worms in the summer of 95. In the fall of 95, we see penises come into being with snails. And then backbones come into being in about May of 96. Now, I sometimes humorously note it to audiences that, penises emerged, they came into being when brains were really, really small and before the males had backbones. So I'm sure there's a connection there. Life comes on land. First, of course, bacteria, and then the plants and insects, and then later amphibians in late 96. The dinosaurs ruled from early spring of 98 until probably late May or early June of 99, 65 million years ago, where they go extinct, except for the birds, which emerged from the dinosaurs, but they just dominated the planet during that time. Breasts and emotions. I mentioned breasts because I mentioned penises, so but we say mammals emerge here in late 98. And then if we take a look at the last 24 hours, okay, so this is the last day, December 31st of the 99th year, in terms of a 100-year time scale, the last 400,000 years. And again, each minute on this cosmic century timeline is 250 years. We only see in the last day, really, symbolic language, that is words, where words are symbols that point beyond themselves to something more. We see words develop roughly 400,000 years ago in Homo sapiens. And this is also the era of the foraging era, families and clans and bands, continuing both from 700 or 400,000 years ago until actually quite recently. I mean, you still find some families and clans and bands in remote parts of the world. 72,000 years ago, and KYA is the scientific terminology for thousands of years ago, we find Toba, the supervolcano Toba. There's about a half a dozen supervolcanoes in the world, and one of them goes off, roughly every 100,000 years, and 72,000 years ago, Toba went off. And it actually, we call it the human bottleneck. We now know from genetic testing that the human species was almost wiped out. It created what we would call a nuclear winter, not nuclear, I guess, but supervolcano winter. And possibly less than 10,000 human beings survived. There was genetic diversity, and then 72,000 years ago, it was bottlenecked. And then all of us are descendants of those who survived Toba. And that was only at 7 o'clock in the evening on the last day of a 100-year time scale. At 9 o'clock in the evening, we see tribes emerging, this greater complexity of, 200, 300, 400 or more human beings cooperating in an interdependent, you could say multicellular organism at that scale. Now, the last hour, let's just take a look at the last hour on a 100-year time scale. So we're talking December 31st of the 99th year, and this is from 11 p.m. till midnight. Again, each minute is 250 years. The agricultural revolution, roughly 10,000 years ago, occurred at 11:20 p.m. That's where we start domesticating plants and animals. Chiefdoms and kingdoms we see emerging only a half hour ago, roughly 7,500 years ago. And that's a new level of complexity, a new level of interdependence and cooperation. You could say a new level of, a new scale of multicellular organism in terms of social organisms. Writing develops only in the last 5,000 years at 1140 p.m., which, of course, that rather quickly makes possible the emergence of empires, a new level of complexity, a new level of cooperation, a new level of interdependence. The axial age, what's been called the axial age, roughly 2,500 years ago, we find many of the great religious traditions and philosophical systems. And again, part of it is complexity. We see these city-states that where we have to find ways of cooperating across a larger swath of differences. But this is called the axial age. The Industrial Revolution, we're talking the last minute, only 200 years ago. And then we've only had unnatural understandings of God since we've had the clockwork universe. 500 years ago, roughly, we started thinking of nature as a complex clock. What happened, basically, is we started using pendulum clocks as our metaphor for analogy, or analogy for what nature, what reality was like. And if you imagine nature as a complex clock, the only place that God can be, the only place that the creator of the clock can be, is outside of it. So we start seeing unnatural and otherworldly notions of God. Prior to that, in all traditions, and especially here in the West, we find God being spoken of as immanent and omnipresent. That is, there was no place that God stopped and something else started. But once you think of nature as a complex clock, you can still have the concept of immanence and omnipresence, but you can't feel it, you can't experience it. And so God becomes trivialized as a clockmaker outside a clockwork universe, and nature becomes desacralized. Nature becomes just an it to be used and exploited by us, rather than a thou to be honored and respected in its own right. In fact, this whole notion of a clockwork universe emerging at the same time as an unnatural or otherworldly notion of God. Thomas Berry, a quote that I began this series with, that was a little different than this, but similar. He says, "Our difficulty is that we have become spiritually autistic. We no longer listen to what the earth, its landscape and climate, its mountains and valleys, and all the flora and fauna of the planet are telling us." This is the tragedy, the great tragedy of the mechanistic worldview. This is also the great tragedy of imagining God as only otherworldly, only supernatural, only unnatural. In fact, I want to talk about the myth of the so-called supernatural, because we use language. Language, words create worlds, as I said at the beginning in part 1, and I'll be coming back to in a later session as well. There was no concept. The only place that the supernatural realm has ever existed in human language or concepts is in the last 500 or 600 years. Only since we started understanding things in a natural, factual way was there a need by some to propose a supernatural realm, a realm that was beyond or above or outside nature. Prior to that, there was the visible and the invisible. There was the ordinary and the extraordinary. Yes, we spoke of this, most cultures talk of the spirit realm, but this was not supernatural. This was part of reality. In fact, this paper was a really important paper that's now become the standard. Supernatural as a Western Category by Benson Saylor. It was published in the Journal of the American Association, or the American Anthropological Association, Ethos, Volume 5, Volume 5, Number 1, back in spring of 1977. And it's now the standard. I mean, there were several attempts to, say that no, Benson Saylor didn't quite have it right, but then there have been many others who said, yeah, he's right, and now it's just accepted by the vast, vast majority of anthropologists. And in fact, 2 books that cover this in profound detail: Faces in the Clouds, A New Theory of Religion by Stuart Guthrie, published by Oxford University Press in 1994. I cannot recommend that book too highly. It's a must-read, in my opinion, and I'll come back to why I think that book is so significant in the next episode. But also a textbook that's fabulous. I just read it 5 months ago, called Supernatural as Natural, A Biocultural Approach to Religion by Michael Winkelman and John Baker. And again, these 2 books are, in my opinion, must-reads on this whole notion of supernatural. Because supernatural is by definition unnatural. Anything that's supposedly supernatural is by definition unnatural. And I'll come back to why most people find unnatural fairly uninspiring when we really stop and think about it. here in a little bit. Now, again, what we're talking about is the next minute on the cosmic century timeline. So here we are looking forward, okay? We've taken a look at a 100-year time scale. At that time scale, every minute is 250 years. But if we look out, think about it. If we've got 100 years of trends and data to understand, our best scientific understanding of the last 100 years, we ought to be able to say with at least a little bit degree of certainty what the next minute might be like. And that's what this is about. These aren't the challenges that we might have to deal with. We're going to have to deal with climate change, with peak oil, with the biodiversity crisis, with human population, with the growing gap between the rich and the poor, and with this ever symbiotic relationship between us and our technology. And then there are things that we may or may not have to deal with, but by God, if we have to deal with any of these things, these wild cards, they're going to be huge. Things like supervolcano eruptions or methane burps, asteroid impacts, significant solar activity, pole shift. Periodically, the poles of Earth have shifted, shutting down in the Gulf Stream, geopolitical conflicts, nuclear, biological, or chemical, or genetic, nanotechnology, or robotic error or terror, and epidemics. These obviously are wild cards. And I share this, this is the scary stuff. I share this because I want people to have authentic hope, and we're not going to have authentic hope if we're in denial about what we're definitely going to have to deal with, or what we might have to deal with. But then what I have in some of my previous programs focused on are what are some of the long-term and the short-term positive trends that we can bank on. We can trust that chaos and bad news will continue to catalyze creative transformation as it has for billions of years. This evolutionary emergence paradigm will be transforming social structures. We can trust, we can count on that happening in the coming 250 years, the next minute on the cosmic century timeline. Unless climate change is so severe that it just, practically wipes out humanity. Technology will continue to enable and empower human connectedness as it has consistently. Information will continue to be shared more often, more widely, and more deeply. This is a long-term trend that we can trust will continue to occur. Wider circles of care and commitment. We keep finding humanity having larger circles of care, compassion, cooperation, and commitment. At one time, we only had our in-group was our tribe, our family, our clan. And we keep finding ways of expanding our circles of care and compassion. Cooperation as well, of course. Better feedback. When you look at the history of feedback, we keep finding ways, not just humanity, but this goes back even into pre-human forms. We keep finding ways of getting better feedback at all scales of reality. And finally, what I'm calling religion 3.0, what others, Bron Taylor speaks of dark green religion, what Larry Rasmussen calls earth-honoring faith, earth-honoring religion, factual faith, whatever you call it. But this valuing of evidence and a valuing of nature, and like I said before in the first program, this commitment to the 2 commandments of live in right relationship to reality and ensure a just and healthy future. We can count on that to continue to flourish. And then finally, what's the likely good news? I'm not talking about crossing our fingers and toes and praying that Jesus, the cosmic janitor, comes and cleans up the mess we've made. What are the likely things that are good news given current trends? I think we're going to see population stabilizing and then declining, even without the droughts that climate change is likely to bring. But that could cause it to even happen faster. Cleaner, distributed energy. The 6th great mass extinction ending, quite likely in the next 100 years. And again, we could see many, many, many more species dying because of climate change. I don't want to underestimate the significant challenges of climate change. Biomimicry design revolution. That is where we're mimicking biology rather than mimicking machines and our best understanding of reality and designing our technology and cities and everything else on that. Global democratic and biocratic revolution. Thomas Berry said the democracies are a conspiracy against the natural world because they give all rights and privileges to humans and human corporations at the expense of the natural world. We've got to include the rights of other species and bioregions. A worldwide evolutionary and ecological religious revival. Again, this is impacting all religions, and secular people are doing it. You don't have to be traditionally religious, but this worldwide evolutionary, ecological, inspirational transformation is happening and will continue to happen. And finally, nested interests align. I'll talk more about that in the last segment, that one of the main mechanisms that has helped us, cooperate at larger and wider scale, is the aligning of the self-interest of the parts and the well-being of the whole that the parts are a part of. Big history reveals the evolutionary significance of religion, that is, the psychological and social significance of religion, and the religious significance of science, that is, the inspirational and revelatory significance of science. So again, in conclusion, here are some resources that I highly recommend. The Evolutionary Significance of Religion, David Sloan Wilson's fabulous book, Darwin's Cathedral, which is one of the standard books, one of the foundational books in this Evolutionary Significance of Religion. Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. In fact, chapters 9 through 12, I believe it is, in that book is the single best articulation of the evolutionary significance of religion that I've ever read. Ara Noriazen, Big Gods, How Religion Transformed Cooperation and Conflict. This is the best overview of the entire field of evolutionary religious studies, where there's now like 130 or 150 scholars from all different religious traditions, as well as bunches of humanists and atheists and skeptics and free thinkers that are trying to understand religion from our best scientific understanding. And this is the best overview, Big Gods. The Social Conquest of Earth by Edward O. Wilson, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, also one of the leading and most respected biologists on the planet. In fact, David Sloan Wilson, Edward O. Wilson, and Richard Dawkins are probably the three most widely respected theorists of evolution, evolutionary theorists. And David Sloan Wilson and Edward O. Wilson agree on the significance of religion. Richard Dawkins has a different perspective. And then William Grassie's book, The New Sciences of Religion. It's about understanding spirituality from the outside and from the bottom up. And then also the inspirational significance of science. These are the top books in that field, in this whole understanding, or certainly the ones that I would recommend most highly. My wife Connie Barlow's book, Green Space, Green Time, The Way of Science. You could say The Spirituality of Science. I think it's my favorite book in religious naturalism. Obviously I'm biased, but it really is a fabulous book. Everybody else would, in this movement agrees. Dancing with the Sacred, Evolution, Ecology, and God by Carl Peters. Reinventing the Sacred by Stuart Kauffman, the great complexity theorist and scientist. The Sacred Depths of Nature by Ursula Goodenough, a fabulous short little book that's just one of the best books in religious naturalism. And then Chet Ramo, best-selling author, When God Is Gone, Everything Is Holy. And what he means by God is a fictional, unnatural understanding of God. I'll say a lot more in the next program about the distinction between fictional and factual understandings of God. That is unnatural versus undeniable understandings of God. But the God he's rejecting is the same God that Richard Dawkins rejects, which is a fictional, unnatural understanding of God. And this is a fabulous book by Chet Ramo. So what we covered in this section, or actually in number one, which was the big picture, what big history is and why it's important, and how a big history view of God and religion differs from other approaches. In part two here, we covered what big history reveals about the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious or inspirational significance of science, and how our sources of knowledge and wisdom have expanded through time. In section 3, which is titled, what did I title section 3? Oh, Reality Rules. We'll look at what and where is God in big history, and why does it matter? Here are questions for reflection and discussion. Again, I'm not going to read these. If you are a study group leader and you want to use this beta version with study groups, these are some questions. And as I said before, I'm open to all suggestions for improvement on these questions or any aspect of this program. And in the final version that I'll upload in September, I'll also have this. I'm available to speak with groups via Skype, conference call, or speakerphone to respond to questions and that sort of thing. Here's my contact information.